The day Joshua died, no one was appointed to replace him. That single fact that silence after a great leader falls would send an entire nation into a spiral lasting 330 years. What happens to a people when there is no law, no army, no court, no king, and every enemy within 100 miles knows it? You are about to enter the most chaotic, brutal, and strangely fascinating era in the entire Hebrew Bible. A period where God's chosen people were not marching in triumph. They were hiding grain in underground pits so they wouldn't starve. They were building villages on impossible mountain peaks because that was the only place enemy war chariots couldn't reach. They were sending body parts through the mail to start a civil war. This is the book of Judges, and it is nothing like what you learned in Sunday school. Historians call this period the early Iron Age collapse. Archaeologists have excavated the evidence. Hundreds of small hilltop settlements appearing almost overnight across the highlands of Canaan. Carved cisterns in solid rock to catch rainwater. Secret grain silos hidden beneath the floors of homes. This is not mythology. This is a people in survival mode. And yet out of this chaos emerged some of the most unlikely heroes in recorded history. A left-handed assassin who hid his blade on the wrong side of his body because he knew the guards would only check one side. A female judge who sat under a palm tree and ran a nation and led an army into battle when every man around her was too afraid to move. A terrified farmer threshing wheat at the bottom of a wine press, so desperate to hide his food that he couldn't see what he was about to become. A man of supernatural strength who was brought down not by iron weapons, not by an army, but by a woman and a secret he couldn't keep. Each of them rose.
But now there is no
Each of them
turning back.
fell. And after every cycle, Israel sank a little deeper. This channel exists for one reason: to take the stories that shaped Western civilization and show you what they actually looked like, not as stained glass figures, but as real human beings making decisions under impossible pressure. If that is why you are here, you are in the right place. Now let's go back to 1200 BC and watch a nation come apart at the seams.
We must escape! Run, hide! The pillars are cracking!
There is a particular kind of silence that follows the death of a great man. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of a world holding its breath, waiting to see what will fill the space he left behind. When Joshua died, that silence fell over the whole of Israel, and nothing came to fill it. For 40 years, this people had followed a voice. First Moses, the man who stood before Pharaoh without flinching, who stretched his staff over the sea and watched the waters obey. Then Joshua, the general who led them across the Jordan, who marched them around Jericho until the walls fell not to battering rams, but to the sound of trumpets and faith. These were men whose authority was never questioned, because the evidence of God's presence walked with them like a pillar of fire. But Joshua left no successor, no name written down, no hand placed on any man's shoulder before the breath left his body. And so the 12 tribes of Israel, a people forged in the furnace of Egypt, hardened by 40 years in the wilderness, sharpened by years of warfare in Canaan, simply scattered, not in defeat, not in panic, but in the quiet, dangerous way that a fire scatters when the wind changes. Each tribe turned toward its own inheritance, its own hills, its own survival. The national army that had taken Jericho dissolved back into 12 separate clans. There was no capital city, no central court, no standing military force. The Bible captures this entire era in a single sentence, repeated like a haunting refrain throughout the book of Judges. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. To modern ears, that might sound like freedom. Like the dream of a society without overreach, without bureaucracy, without a government telling you what to do. But in 1200 BC, in a land surrounded by hostile nations, it was not freedom. It was an open wound. The land Israel had entered was not empty. The Canaanites still held the fertile valleys, the plains of Jezreel, the coastal roads, the river crossings. All of it remained in the hands of people who had lived there for generations and had no intention of leaving. And they had something Israel did not: iron. The Canaanite city-states had mastered iron smelting at a time when most of the ancient Near East was still working in bronze. This was not a minor technological difference. This was the gap between a sword that bends and a sword that cuts through armor. Between a plow that scratches the surface and a plow that breaks hard ground. Between a chariot wheel that cracks under pressure and one that rolls over men like stone. 900 iron chariots. That is the number the book of Judges records for Sisera, the Canaanite general who controlled the north. 900. Each one a machine of war, pulled by trained war horses, carrying archers and spearmen who could strike before a foot soldier ever got close enough to fight back. Against this, Israel had bronze weapons, and courage, and prayer. It was not enough to hold the valleys, so they climbed. Archaeologists excavating the central highlands of Canaan have found something remarkable: a sudden explosion of small settlements appearing on the hilltops during this exact period. Not cities, not fortresses, villages. Tiny clusters of stone houses perched on ridges so steep and rocky that no chariot could follow. These people were not choosing their location for comfort. The hilltops had no rivers, no natural springs. The soil was thin and stubborn. The wind was brutal in winter. They chose those heights for one reason only: because the iron wheels of their enemies could not reach them there. But survival on a mountain requires water, and water does not flow uphill. So Israel innovated out of desperation. They learned to carve cisterns directly into the bedrock, deep, bell-shaped chambers lined with a specific type of waterproof plaster that could hold rainwater for months. These were not wells. Wells require a water table. These were stone vessels buried in the earth, filling slowly during the rainy season, rationed carefully through the long dry months. It was a brilliant solution born from necessity, and it kept people alive. But it did not solve the hunger. The valleys were where grain grew rich and full. The valleys were where olive trees had stood for generations, their roots deep and their fruit abundant. The valleys were where a family could build something lasting. But the valleys belonged to the enemy. So the Israelites planted what they could on the rocky terraces they carved into the hillsides. They raised sheep and goats on the sparse mountain grass. They lived carefully, quietly, always watching the horizon for the dust cloud that meant riders were coming. And then came the Midianites. They did not come to conquer territory. Conquerors at least build something after they destroy. The Midianites came like a plague of locusts. The text of Judges uses that exact word, arriving on camels in numbers so vast that counting them was pointless. They came at harvest time, when months of labor were finally ripe and ready, and they consumed everything. Grain fields burned, livestock slaughtered or taken, olive groves stripped bare. And then they left, leaving behind only silence and famine, returning again the following year to do it again. For 7 years, this went on. The Israelites stopped storing food in visible granaries. They dug secret silos beneath the floors of their homes, hiding their grain underground like men burying treasure, hoping the raiders would not think to look beneath their feet. They stopped sleeping easily. They stopped planning for the future, because the future was uncertain in a way that corrodes the soul. There is a weight that settles on a people who have lived in fear for long enough. It is not the sharp terror of a single moment of danger. It is something heavier and slower, the grinding exhaustion of never being safe, never being certain, never being able to simply plant a field and trust that it will still be standing when harvest comes. That weight had settled over Israel, and it was in the middle of that weight, in the valley of Jezreel, in the shadow of Midianite raids, in a world where hope had learned to keep itself hidden, that God chose his next unlikely servant. Not in a palace, not on a battlefield, in a wine press, underground, where a frightened man was hiding his grain. There are moments in history when God does not send an army. He sends one person, with one weapon, into one room, and everything changes. The oppression of Moab had lasted 18 years. 18 years of tribute caravans crossing the Jordan, carrying the wealth of Israel into the hands of King Eglon, a man the text of Judges describes with a word that feels almost contemptuous in its precision. He was very fat. Not a detail thrown in carelessly. In the ancient world, obesity on a king was a sign of excess, of a man who consumed far more than his share, who grew heavy on the labor of others while the people he taxed grew thin. For 18 years, Eglon sat in his palace across the river and grew heavier, and Israel grew smaller. There was no general to call, no standing army to mobilize. The same vacuum of leadership that had left Israel vulnerable after Joshua's death had never truly been filled.
God, please.
So when the cry for deliverance finally rose, and it always rose eventually, because a people can endure suffering for only so long before something in them breaks toward prayer, God's answer came in the form of a man from the tribe of Benjamin. His name was Ehud, and he was left-handed. In the ancient Near East, left-handedness was rare enough to be noticed and strange enough to be distrusted. Warriors trained exclusively with the right hand. Sword technique, shield positioning, the geometry of close combat, all of it assumed a right-handed fighter. To be left-handed was considered, in many cultures of that era, a kind of deficiency. But deficiency, in the hands of God, has a way of becoming the precise tool the moment requires. Ehud understood his advantage with the cold clarity of a man who had thought through every detail of what he was about to do. He forged a double-edged dagger 18 inches long, short enough to conceal completely, and strapped it to his right thigh. Not his left, his right. That detail is everything. Palace guards in the ancient world were trained to search visitors on the left side of the body. That was where weapons were carried. That was where danger came from. A right-handed man reaching across his body for a blade on his left hip, that was the motion they watched for, the gesture they were trained to interrupt. No one checked the right thigh of a man bringing tribute to a king. Ehud walked into Eglon's presence with the tribute delegation, completed the official transaction, and then turned back at the edge of the city. He sent the others ahead and returned alone. He told the king's servants that he carried a secret message, a word from God, meant only for the king's ears. Even kings hunger for divine favor. Even powerful men want to believe that heaven has something to say specifically to them. Eglon cleared the room. The two men were alone now. The king rose from his throne to receive the message, the way one stands to honor something sacred. And in that moment of reverence, in the breath between rising and hearing, Ehud reached across his body with his left hand, drew the blade from his right thigh, and drove it into the king's belly. The text of Judges does not look away from what happened next. It records it with the unflinching directness of an eyewitness account. The fat closed over the blade. Ehud could not withdraw it. He left it there, locked inside the king, and walked out through the porch, closing and locking the doors behind him with the quietness that must have required nerves made of something harder than bone. The servants waited outside. They assumed the king was relieving himself. They waited. They deliberated. They waited longer. By the time they finally opened the doors and found their king dead on the floor, Ehud was already across the Jordan, already blowing the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, already calling the tribes to war. 10,000 Moabite soldiers died that day. Not one escaped. And the land had rest for 80 years. 80 years is a long time. Long enough for a generation to grow up without knowing what oppression feels like. Long enough for the memory of Ehud's courage to fade into legend, and for the habits of faithfulness that sustained his era to slowly loosen their grip on the hearts of the people who came after. When the 80 years ended, the enemy waiting on the other side was not a fat king across a river. It was 900 iron chariots, and a general named Sisera who had never lost a battle. For 20 years, Sisera and the Canaanite king Jabin had dominated the northern tribes of Israel. The iron monopoly that had pushed Israel into the highlands now manifested in its most terrifying form, a standing armored force that controlled every road, every valley, every route of commerce and movement in the north. 20 years of systematic humiliation. 20 years of watching your sons grow up in a world where the enemy owned the flatlands and you owned only the rocks. Into this silence came a woman sitting under a palm tree. Her name was Deborah, and she was already leading Israel before anyone asked her to lead an army. The text introduces her with a matter-of-fact authority that is remarkable for its era. She was a prophetess. She judged Israel. The people came to her with their disputes, their grievances, their impossible questions, and she rendered decisions that held. In a society without courts, without central government, without any formal structure of justice, Deborah was the structure. She was the court. She was the institution. She summoned a man named Barak and gave him a command that could only have come from someone utterly certain of her source. Take 10,000 men to Mount Tabor. Draw Sisera's army to the Kishon River. God will deliver them into your hand. Barak's response reveals everything about the spiritual condition of Israel in that moment. He would not go without her. This was not a small hesitation. This was a military commander, a man whose entire identity in that culture was bound up in the willingness to face death, refusing to move toward battle unless a woman walked beside him. It was the admission, spoken aloud, that he did not trust his own connection to the divine enough to act on it. That without Deborah's presence, he could not believe the promise would hold. She agreed to go, but she told him plainly what it would cost him. The glory of this victory, she said, would not belong to him. It would belong to a woman. He went anyway, and the battle that followed did not look like any battle Sisera had planned for. The iron chariots that had dominated the valleys for 20 years needed firm, dry ground to function. Iron wheels and iron axles and war horses bred for speed, these things require a stable surface. Remove the surface, and the technology becomes a track. What removed the surface was rain. The book of Judges records a sudden, torrential storm that transformed the plain beside the Kishon River into a field of deep mud. The chariots that were supposed to sweep through Israel's infantry like blades through wheat instead lurched, bogged down, tilted sideways. Horses panicked. Drivers lost control. The greatest military advantage in the region became 900 pieces of useless iron sinking slowly into the earth. Israel's foot soldiers, unburdened by machinery, moves through the mud freely. The slaughter was total. Sisera abandoned his chariot and fled on foot, which means the most feared general in Canaan ended that day running alone through open country, trying to disappear before someone recognized him. He found what he thought was sanctuary in the tent of a woman named Yael. Her clan was at peace with Jalbin. She had no formal obligation to Israel. When Sisera arrived at her tent, gasping and desperate, she welcomed him with the full hospitality of the desert, the code that demanded protection for any guest who crossed your threshold. She covered him with a blanket. When he asked for water, she gave him milk, rich and warm, the kind that pulls a body toward sleep. He made her promise to tell anyone who came looking that no one was there. Then he closed his eyes. She waited until his breathing deepened. Then she picked up a tent peg and a hammer, the tools of her daily life, objects she had handled 1,000 times, and drove the peg through his temple into the ground beneath him. When Barak arrived, still pursuing the man he had been chasing, Yael met him at the entrance of her tent. "Come," she said. "I will show you the man you are looking for." And there lay Sisera, dead. Just as Deborah had said, the glory did not belong to the general. It belonged to a woman who understood that sometimes the most decisive act of faith looks nothing like what anyone expected. Israel rested for 40 years after that. But rest, in the book of Judges, is never the end of the story. It is only the pause before the next descent, the held breath before the pattern begins again. And the next time the darkness came, it would not come with chariots. It would come with camels. Countless camels, filling the horizon like a living flood, stripping the land bare before disappearing back into the desert, leaving nothing behind but hunger in the ashes of what had been planted with such hope. And the man God would choose to answer that darkness was, at this very moment, hiding in a hole in the ground, a man so afraid that he had given up on the open air entirely. His name was Gideon, and he was about to receive a visitor he was not ready for. If you believe that God uses the unlikely, the left-handed, the overlooked, the woman with a tent peg to accomplish what armies cannot, let that truth settle in you for a moment.
We need to go.
This story is far from over. There is a difference between a man who is humble and a man who is simply afraid. Humility looks inward and says, I am not enough for this, but I will go anyway. Fear looks inward and says, I am not enough for this, and so I will stay exactly where I am. When we first meet Gideon, he is fear. Pure, practical, understandable fear. The kind that does not need explanation, because anyone who understood his world would feel exactly the same thing. The Midianites had been coming for 7 years. Not settling, not conquering, consuming. They arrived each year at harvest, the precise moment when months of grueling labor finally produced something worth taking, and they came in numbers that defied easy counting. The book of Judges reaches for the only comparison that felt adequate to the people living through it. They came like locusts, like a living storm that strips everything green from the land and moves on, leaving behind only bare stalks and silence. They rode camels, a technology of mobility that gave them a devastating strategic advantage. Where foot soldiers and even horse cavalry were limited by terrain and fatigue, camel riders could cross desert distances that no pursuing army could match. They struck fast, consumed everything, and dissolved back into the wilderness before any organized resistance could form. 7 years of this. 7 harvests reduced to ash and empty granaries.
God, it's so cold.
7 winters survived on whatever could be hidden underground before the riders came. The Israelites had stopped farming openly. They had stopped storing grain in visible places. They had learned to bury their food the way frightened people bury their most precious things, in secret, in darkness, beneath the surface of ordinary life, hoping the enemy would not think to look that deep. Which is why, when we find Gideon, he is at the bottom of a wine press. A wine press was designed for one thing: crushing grapes. It was a pit cut into rock, deliberately sunken below the surface of the ground, sheltered from the wind. The absence of wind was precisely the point.
God, help me.
You needed the wind to process grain, to toss it into the air so the breeze could carry away the chaff and leave the heavier kernels to fall back down. Every Israelite farmer knew this. Threshing happened on hilltops and open ground, where the air moved freely. Doing it in a wine press was agricultural nonsense. But agricultural nonsense kept you alive when the alternative was doing it in the open and having Midianite scouts seed the grain, dust rising against the sky. So there was Gideon. underground, hidden, threshing wheat by hand in a pit, in still air, in the dark, doing something inefficient and exhausting and wrong by every standard of farming practice, because the alternative was being seen. And it was there in the bottom of that hole, in that act of quiet desperation, that an angel of the Lord appeared and sat down under the oak tree above him. What the messenger said next is one of the great ironies of the entire Hebrew Bible. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon's response is honest in a way that most people are not honest when heaven speaks to them. He did not fall to his knees. He did not weep with gratitude. He looked up from his underground threshing floor and essentially said, "If the Lord is with us, then why is any of this happening?" It is a fair question. It is the question that anyone living through 7 years of systematic destruction would ask. Where is the God of the Exodus? Where are the miracles our fathers told us about? We have been handed over to this, and no one has come. The answer that came back was not an explanation. It was a commission. Go in this strength you have.
No, please.
Save Israel from Midian's hand. Have I not sent you? Gideon pushed back. His clan was the weakest in Manasseh. He was the least in his father's house. He was the wrong man, from the wrong family, in the wrong place, hiding in a hole, for reasons that felt entirely justified. But God, throughout the entire sweep of this era, had demonstrated a consistent preference for exactly this kind of person. Not the impressive, not the prepared, not the ones who looked like leaders from the outside. The left-handed man, the woman under the palm tree, the man in the wine press. The strength that is required, it seems, is never the strength you already have. It is always the strength that arrives at the moment you decide to move. Gideon asked for signs. Not once, multiple times. He set out fleece on the ground and asked for the dew to fall only on the fleece while the ground around it stayed dry. It did. Then he asked for the opposite, dry fleece, wet ground. It happened again. He was a man who needed the reassurance repeated, who could not quite let himself believe that what was happening was real. God gave him the signs. And then God did something that, by every military calculation in the ancient world, made no sense at all. He started reducing the army. 32,000 men had responded to Gideon's call. Against a Midianite force, the text later numbers at 135,000. Israel was already outnumbered 4-1. And God said too many. The logic given is precise and unsettling. If Israel won with 32,000, they would believe they had won by their own strength. The victory would become a monument to human military capability rather than divine intervention. And a people who believed their own arm had saved them would not remain dependent on the one who actually had. So the army was cut. First to 10,000, those who stayed after the afraid were sent home. Then to 300, those who drank from the river in a specific way that Gideon himself probably did not fully understand the significance of. 300 men against 135,000. Even the math of faith, it turns out, requires you to let go of the math entirely. On the night before the battle, God told Gideon to go down to the edge of the Midianite camp and listen. If he was afraid, and he was, the text does not pretend otherwise, listening with strength in his hands for what was coming. Gideon went down in the darkness, close enough to hear two soldiers talking inside a tent. One of them had just had a dream. A loaf of barley bread, the food of the poor, the food of the highlands, the food of a people who could not afford wheat, came tumbling into the Midianite camp and struck a tent so hard that it collapsed. The other soldier interpreted the dream without hesitation. This is nothing other than the sword of Gideon. God has given the Midianites into his hand. The enemy was already afraid. They were dreaming about being defeated by a barley loaf. The man who had been hiding in a wine press was already a figure of terror in the nightmares of those who had terrorized him. Gideon worshipped. And then he went back up to his 300 men.
Keep these safe.
He divided them into 3 companies and gave each man the same 3 things:
Stay hidden.
a trumpet, a clay jar, a torch hidden inside the jar. The instructions were simple. Do exactly what I do. When I blow the trumpet, you blow yours. When I break the jar, you break yours. Shout for the Lord and for Gideon. They surrounded the camp in the deep watch of the night, the hours just before dawn, when sleep is heaviest and the mind is least equipped to separate dream from reality. 300 men positioned in a vast circle around a sleeping army of tens of thousands. Then Gideon broke his jar. 300 clay vessels shattered simultaneously in the darkness. 300 torches blazed to life at once, appearing from nowhere, surrounding the camp on every side. 300 trumpets screamed into the night air, and 300 voices roared out of the darkness. For anyone jolted from deep sleep by that explosion of sound and light, by fire appearing on all sides, by noise coming from every direction at once, the only possible conclusion was that an overwhelming force had closed in around him. An army beyond counting. A trap with no exit. The Midianite camp erupted into chaos. Men grabbed weapons and swung them at the shapes nearest to them, which were their own allies, also panicking, also swinging blindly in the dark. The camp turned on itself. The enemy destroyed itself. And by the time the sun rose over the valley of Jezreel, 135,000 soldiers had been routed by the sound of breaking pottery and the light of hidden fire. Gideon had done what no conventional general could have done, precisely because he had never been a conventional general. He had no tradition to follow, no military doctrine to constrain him, no instinct trained toward the expected moves. He had only the specific instructions given to him and 300 men willing to trust that breaking a jar in the dark was somehow enough. It was enough. It was more than enough. But victory, in the book of Judges, always carries within it the seed of the next failure. Gideon won the battle. He refused the crown when it was offered and said something genuinely beautiful in response, something that revealed the man he had become in the journey from wine press to battlefield. "The Lord will rule over you," he said. "Not I." Yet the gold taken from the defeated enemy did not stay as a monument to God's faithfulness. Gideon melted it down. He fashioned from it an ephod, a priestly garment, a sacred object, and placed it in his hometown of Ophrah. and all Israel played the harlot with it there. The text does not soften it. The thing Gideon made with victory's gold became the thing his people bowed down to. Gratitude, left unguarded, had curdled into idolatry. The cycle was turning again before the hero who interrupted it had even died. The land had rest for 40 years, the length of Gideon's life. And when he died, everything unraveled faster than it had before. The next leader Israel would produce would not come from a respected family or a position of tribal honor. He would come from the margins, from the place society discards the people it does not want. He had been thrown out of his own home. He had built his life among outlaws and outcasts. And when the crisis came and the respectable men of Israel had no answer, they would walk to that outcast's store and ask him to save them. His name was Jephthah, and the price he would pay for Israel's deliverance would be the one thing no victory is worth. There are wounds that societies inflict on people and then forget about entirely until the moment they need those same people to save them. Jephthah carried one of those wounds his entire life. He had not chosen the circumstances of his birth. No one does. But in a tribal society built entirely on lineage and inheritance, where your worth was measured by whose blood ran in your veins and whose land would pass into your hands, being born to a prostitute was not merely a personal misfortune. It was a legal verdict. A permanent verdict, with no appeal and no expiration. His half-brothers enforced it with the ruthless efficiency of men protecting something they valued more than decency. "You will not inherit anything in our father's house," they told him. "You are the son of another woman." And they drove him out. He went to a land called Tote, far enough from Gilead that the shame of his origins could not follow him on the lips of every neighbor, close enough to the wilderness that the only law was the law of the strong. There he gathered men around him. The text calls them worthless fellows, vagabonds, men without prospects or position, outcasts, in other words, men who understood what it meant to be unwanted. Together they built something. Not a city, not a kingdom, but a reputation. Jephthah became known in the hill country the way certain men become known, not because they sought recognition, but because their capability made recognition unavoidable. He was a warrior, a leader, a man who knew how to hold a difficult situation together through sheer force of will and tactical intelligence. He was exactly the kind of man that respectable society produces outcasts from and then desperately needs when the world stops being respectable. The Ammonites had been pressing against the eastern border of Israel for 18 years. Not raids, not seasonal harassment, a sustained, grinding pressure that had brought the tribes of Gilead to the edge of collapse. They needed a military commander, someone who understood violence at the level required to face what was coming. The elders of Gilead looked at their options. Then they looked at each other. Then they walked to Tote. The man they had allowed to be thrown out of his own inheritance was now their only hope of keeping theirs. Jephthah did not receive them warmly. "Did you not hate me?" he said. "Did you not drive me out of my father's house? Why have you come to me now when you are in trouble?" It is the question of every person who has been discarded and then summoned back when they become useful. The elders did not deny it. They offered him instead what they could not give him before: authority. If he led them into battle and won, he would become head over all of Gilead. Not a mercenary, not a temporary asset, a ruler. Jephthah accepted, but he accepted as a man who had learned, in the hard school of exile, that words spoken aloud in the presence of witnesses carry weight. He made them repeat the terms before the Lord at Mizpah. He would not trust a handshake. He had lived long enough to know what handshakes were worth to men who found them inconvenient. Before the fighting began, Jephthah tried something that reveals a dimension of his character that the simple outline of his story often obscures. He sent messengers to the Ammonite king. Not threats. Diplomacy. A careful, detailed rehearsal of the historical record of how Israel had come to occupy the lands the Ammonites were now claiming, of the legal and historical basis for Israel's presence on the disputed territory. The Ammonite king did not listen. Some conflicts cannot be argued out of existence. Some men have decided what they want and constructed their justifications afterward, and no amount of historical accuracy will move them. Jephthah had done what could be done through words. Now the only language left was the one he had spoken fluently since his years in Tob. He prepared for war, and then he made a vow. It is at this point that the narrative slows, the way stories slow when they are approaching something they cannot rush past. Jephthah stood before God and made a promise, the kind that feels, in the heat of the moment before battle, like an act of faith, like a transaction of devotion, like the most serious thing a man can do to demonstrate how much he wants the outcome he is asking for. Whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites, it shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering. The words seemed clear enough to him when he spoke them. A warrior returning home expected to be greeted by his household, by servants, by animals, by the ordinary life he had left behind. The ancient world was full of vows spoken in the urgency of desperate moments. The mistake was not in making a vow. The mistake was in the precision, or rather, the absence of it. He left a door open he did not know was open. The battle itself was decisive. Jephthah swept through 20 Ammonite cities. The border was secured. The 18 years of pressure released in a campaign that demonstrated exactly why the elders of Gilead had walked all the way to Tob to find him. He turned toward home, toward the life he had been promised, toward the authority and belonging he had been denied since childhood. And the first thing that came through the door of his house to meet him was his daughter, his only child, dancing, tambourines in her hands, her face full of joy at her father's return, at the victory, at the life stretching out ahead of them that now finally looked like it had a shape worth living into. The text says Jephthah tore his clothes. It is one of the most devastating images in all of Scripture, that specific act of grief, garments ripped open, the body's way of expressing what language cannot hold. He had come home to the one thing he could not bear to lose, and the vow he had spoken in the darkness before battle was already closing around both of them like walls. She did not beg him to break it. That detail is almost unbearable in what it reveals about her. She understood the weight of what her father had promised. She understood in the way that people who have grown up watching faith practiced at cost understand that a vow made to God was not a preference, not an intention, not a feeling. It was a word spoken into the air that now had to be honored, no matter the price. She asked for 2 months to go into the mountains with her companions, to greet not her death, the text is careful, but her virginity, the life she would not have, the children who would not come, the ordinary human future that the vow had taken from her before she had any say in the matter. Jephthah gave her the 2 months. When she returned, the text says only this: he did to her according to his vow that he had made. The Bible does not elaborate. It does not explain. It moves on, the way Scripture sometimes moves on from the hardest things, not because they are unimportant, but because some weights are meant to be carried in silence, not analyzed into manageable pieces. What are we to make of Jephthah? He was not a cruel man. He was not a foolish man in the ordinary sense. He was a man formed by rejection and exile, who had learned to operate in a world where your word was the only currency that could not be taken from you because everything else already had been. His vow was reckless, but it was reckless in the way that deeply wounded people are sometimes reckless, reaching for the most extreme gesture of commitment because ordinary gestures had never been enough to secure what they needed. He won the battle. He saved the border. He fulfilled the vow. And he extinguished his own line in the process. The man who had been denied inheritance now had no one to pass it to. There is a particular kind of tragedy reserved for people who achieve everything they fought for and lose the one thing that made it worth fighting. Jephthah lived inside the tragedy for the rest of his life. The cycle continued. After Jephthah came other judges, names that passed through the text quickly, like the brief stability of shallow water before the current picks up again. And then came the Philistines. Not raiders. Not a king across a river. Not a seasonal plague that could be endured until the moment of deliverance. The Philistines were a civilization, a maritime power that had arrived on the coast of Canaan with advanced metallurgy, organized city-states, and a long institutional memory of how to dominate a region and keep it dominated. They would oppress Israel for 40 years. And God's answer to 40 years of Philistine domination would not be a general, or a judge, or a woman under a palm tree. It would be a man whose strength was unlike anything the ancient world had seen and whose weakness would prove equally extraordinary. He was not born yet, but the preparations for his arrival had already begun. And the story of what he would become and what he would destroy, in both directions, was unlike anything that had come before in the long, strange history of Israel's judges. If you have ever felt that the things that disqualified you were actually preparing you for something you could not yet see, Jephthah's story is for you. The outcasts of this world have always had a role in a story that the insiders never anticipated. If this moves something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. There is a kind of strength that destroys everything it touches, including itself. Not because strength is wrong, but because strength without wisdom is simply a larger version of the same chaos it was meant to stop. It moves through the world like a fire that does not distinguish between what needs to burn and what needs to be protected. It consumes the enemy and the innocent with equal indifference. and in the end, it consumes the one who carries it. Samson was that kind of strength. And Israel, in its long descent through the era of the judges, had finally arrived at a point where even the most extraordinary gift God had ever placed in a human body was not enough to compensate for what the nation had lost in its soul. He was set apart before he was born. An angel appeared to his mother, a woman unnamed by the text, which is its own kind of injustice, given what she carried, and told her that the child she would conceive was to be a Nazarite from the womb. The Nazarite vow was a covenant of total consecration. No wine, no contact with the dead, and above all, no razor to touch the head. The uncut hair was not superstition. It was the visible sign of an invisible dedication, the mark on the outside of a life that had been given over entirely to something beyond itself. The angel told her that this child would begin to deliver Israel from the Philistines. Not complete the deliverance, begin it. Even in the announcement of his birth, there is a limitation built in, a ceiling, as if heaven already knew that this particular vessel, extraordinary as it was, would not carry the story all the way to its conclusion. The Philistines were unlike any enemy Israel had faced in the era of the judges. They were not desert raiders, not a tributary kingdom across a river. They were a sophisticated maritime civilization that had arrived on the coast of Canaan from the Aegean world, bringing with them organized city governance, advanced military technology, and most critically the secret of iron smelting. Archaeologists have confirmed what the biblical text implies. During this period, the Philistines maintained a deliberate monopoly on iron production in the region. There were no blacksmiths in the Israelite highlands. If an Israelite farmer needed his plow repaired, he had to go to the Philistines and pay their price. To control a people's access to iron in the early Iron Age was to control their ability to farm, to build, and to fight. It was economic domination and military domination dressed as commerce. 40 years Israel lived under this. 40 years of systematic subordination, so complete and so normalized that the text of Judges records something almost unthinkable when the men of Judah handed Samson over to the Philistines, bound with 2 new ropes. They explained their reasoning with a calm that reveals everything about how deep the subjugation had gone. Do you not know that the Philistines rule over us? Not the Philistines oppress us. Not the Philistines are our enemies. Rule over us. As a simple fact of the world. As weather. As geography. That is what 40 years does to a people. It teaches them to call their chains normal. Into this world came Samson, and from the beginning, he operated by rules that no one around him could entirely follow. His strength was real, undeniable, documented in the text with a specificity that resists easy mythologizing. A young lion attacking him on the road to Timnah, he tore it apart with his bare hands, the way one tears a young goat, and told no one. 30 men in Ashkelon, 1,000 Philistine soldiers at Lehi, where he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey on the ground and used it, that still heavy, still wet piece of bone, as a weapon until the field was covered with the dead. 1,000 men with the jawbone. The Philistine military establishment, with its iron weapons and its organized battalions and its proud technological superiority, humiliated by a man who reached down and picked up whatever was on the ground. But the pattern of Samson's battles tells a different story from the pattern of Ehud's or Gideon's or Deborah's. Those judges fought for Israel. Their battles, whatever their personal flaws, were oriented outward toward a people who needed deliverance, toward an enemy that was crushing the nation they served. Samson fought for Samson. When he killed 30 men in Ashkelon, it was to pay a debt from a gambling wager he had lost. When he tied torches to 300 foxes and sent them burning through the Philistine grain fields, a feat of logistical absurdity that somehow actually happened, it was retaliation for a personal humiliation involving his wife. When he struck down 1,000 men at Lehi, it was because the men of Judah had handed him over to his enemies like a piece of property. He was the most powerful man in the region, and he spent that power almost entirely on personal grievances. This is not a condemnation dressed as biography. It is an observation that the text itself seems to be making quietly, consistently, without editorializing. Samson is never called a man after God's own heart. He is never described as faithful or wise or oriented toward anything beyond the immediate satisfaction of his own desires. He was consecrated. He was gifted beyond measure. And he treated both things with a casualness that reads, across 3,000 years, like a man who had simply never been required to take his own calling seriously. He went down to the valley of Sorek, to a woman named Delilah. The Philistine lords came to her separately, each offering 1,100 pieces of silver, a sum so large that it removes any ambiguity about how seriously they took this transaction. They needed to know the source of his strength, not to understand it, to neutralize it. Delilah asked him. He lied to her. She tested the lie against him while he slept and found it false. She asked again. He lied again. She tested again. This cycle repeated itself with a patience on her part and a blindness on his that is, in retrospect, almost impossible to understand in a man of his intelligence. She pressed him daily. She accused him of not loving her, of mocking her, of withholding himself from the one person who claimed to be closest to him. And Samson, this man who had torn lions and routed armies, could not withstand the sustained pressure of a woman's disappointment. He told her everything. No razor has ever come upon my head. I am a Nazirite from birth. If I am shaved, my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. The secret of his consecration, the one thing that stood between him and ordinary humanity, he handed it over for the sake of a relationship that had been designed from the beginning to destroy him. She lulled him to sleep. She called for a man to shave his 7 locks. And when the Philistines rushed in and she cried, Samson, the Philistines are upon you, he woke and thought, as he had thought before, that he would simply shake himself free. The text contains perhaps the saddest 4 words in the entire book of Judges. He did not know. He did not know that the Lord had departed from him. They took his eyes first. Then they bound him with bronze shackles and brought him to Gaza, the city whose gates he had once carried away on his shoulders as a casual demonstration of what he was capable of, and set him to grinding grain in the prison. The strongest man in the world, reduced to the labor of an ox, moving in circles, in the dark, doing the work that the most powerless members of ancient society were assigned. But the text adds one quiet line, almost as an afterthought. The hair of his head began to grow again. The Philistine lords gathered to celebrate. 3,000 people on the roof of the temple of Dagon, their god, who they credited with delivering their greatest enemy into their hands. They called for Samson to be brought out to perform for them, to be displayed as proof of their power and his humiliation. He asked the servant leading him to let him feel the pillars that supported the temple, so he could lean against them. And then he prayed. For the first time in the narrative, genuinely, without agenda, without negotiation, Samson prayed, "Strengthen me just this once, O God. Let me die with the Philistines." He pushed both hands, one pillar to the right, one to the left. The roof came down on the lords, on the people, on 3,000 Philistines gathered to mock the God whose Nazarite they had blinded and broken. The text records quietly that he killed more in his death than in his life. Israel buried him, and the silence that followed was different from the silences that had followed the other judges. Because what came next was not an external enemy pressing against the border. What came next was something that had been building inside the nation for 300 years, all the compromised faith, all the abandoned covenant, all the cycles of forgetting that had deposited, layer by layer, a corruption so deep it had reached the places that were supposed to be holy. The tabernacle at Shiloh, the sacred tent where the Ark of the Covenant rested, where the presence of God had dwelt among the people since the wilderness, had become something else entirely. The high priest Eli was old and nearly blind, which felt, in the circumstances, like a metaphor the text did not need to explain. His sons, Hophni and Phinehas, ran the sanctuary like a private enterprise. They took the best portions of the sacrifices before they were offered. They exploited the women who served at the entrance of the tent. They treated the holy things as leverage, as assets to be used for personal gain. Corruption, when it reaches the priesthood, does not stay in the priesthood. It seeps outward into everything the priesthood was supposed to hold together. If the people cannot trust the sanctuary, they cannot trust the God the sanctuary represents. If the representatives of the holy are revealed as predatory, the holy itself becomes suspect. And a people who have lost their confidence in the holy have nothing left to hold them back from the weight of their own worst impulses. Israel went to war against the Philistines and lost 4,000 men. And then the elders made a decision that revealed exactly how far the understanding of faith had deteriorated. They sent for the Ark of the Covenant, the golden chest that contained the tablets of the law that had led Israel through the wilderness, before whose presence the waters of the Jordan had parted, and they brought it to the battlefield. As a weapon, as a magical object whose proximity would compel God to fight for them, regardless of how they lived, regardless of what Hophni and Phinehas had done in the sanctuary, regardless of everything. When the ark arrived, Israel shouted so loudly the ground shook. The Philistines heard the shout and were terrified until they remembered what terror had done to their ancestors in Egypt, and decided they would rather die fighting than live under that kind of fear. 30,000 Israelite soldiers died. Hophni and Phinehas died. The Ark of God was captured. When the news reached Eli, he fell backward from his seat, broke his neck, and died. His daughter-in-law, in labor when she heard what had happened, named her son Ichabod. The glory has departed and died in childbirth. The glory had departed. The Philistines marched to Shiloh. Archaeologists excavating the site have found what the text does not explicitly describe: a thick layer of ash and destruction, datable to precisely this period. They burned it to the ground. The center of Israel's spiritual life, the place where the presence of God had dwelt among the people, reduced to cinders and silence. And then when it seemed that no lower point was possible, that the nation had exhausted every capacity for self-destruction, Israel found one more. A Levite traveling through the territory of Benjamin stopped for the night in Gibeah. He believed he was among his own people. He was wrong. What happened that night in Gibeah to his concubine, at the hands of men who should have been brothers, was so far beyond the boundaries of what any legal or moral framework could contain that the Levite did what people do when they cannot find words adequate to the horror they have witnessed. He sent pieces of what remained to every tribe, 12 pieces, a body made into a message, a crime made into a summons. 400,000 men gathered. They demanded justice. Benjamin refused to surrender the guilty. And Israel, the 12 tribes who had spent 300 years unable to unite against a common enemy, finally found something capable of uniting them. War against each other. 25,000 Benjaminites died. Their cities burned. 600 survivors fled into the wilderness. The tribe of Benjamin, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, one of the foundational families of the nation, nearly ceased to exist. When the fighting stopped, Israel wept, not in victory, in the particular grief of people who have looked at what their own hands have done and cannot find a way to call it anything other than what it is. They had come to Canaan as 12 tribes. They had nearly left as 11. The era of the judges ended not with a military triumph or a spiritual renewal. It ended with exhaustion, with a people who had cycled through deliverance and abandonment and crisis so many times that the pattern itself had become the only constant in their world. They looked at the chaos around them. They looked at the nations nearby, at Egypt with its pharaohs, at Assyria with its kings, at the orderly, terrible efficiency of centralized power, and they made a decision. They went to Samuel and said, "Give us a king." Not God. A king. Someone they could see. Someone who could march at the head of an army and make the fear stop. Someone whose authority did not depend on faith they were no longer sure they possessed. Samuel warned them of everything a king would cost. The sons conscripted, the daughters taken, the land taxed, the freedom bartered away for the illusion of security. They said, "We do not care. Give us a king." And God, in the most heartbreaking act of divine respect for human choice in the entire Hebrew Bible, said to Samuel, listen to them. The era of the judges was over. The age of kings had begun. And Israel stepped into it carrying everything the 300 years had deposited in them: the courage and the cowardice, the faith and the idolatry, the extraordinary capacity for deliverance and the equally extraordinary capacity for self-destruction. They were, in other words, exactly what they had always been. Exactly what we have always been. 330 years. That is how long the era of the judges lasted. 330 years of a cycle so consistent, so precisely repeated, that reading it from the outside feels almost like watching a mathematical equation work itself out across centuries of human lives. The people forget. The consequences arrive. The suffering deepens until it becomes unbearable. A deliverer rises always from an unexpected place, always carrying an unexpected gift, always arriving through a door that no one thought to watch. The deliverance comes. The land rests. And then, slowly, quietly, in the ordinary days between the crises, the forgetting begins again. Round and round. Generation after generation. The wheel churning with the terrible patience of something that does not get tired. But here is what the cycle does not tell you, if you only read it from a distance. Every person inside that cycle was fully real. Every generation that forgot had reasons for forgetting, reasons that made sense in the context of daily life, in the accumulated weight of surviving, in the very human tendency to let the urgent crowd out the important until the important disappears entirely. Ehud was a real man who spent real time thinking through every detail of what he was about to do, knowing that if he miscalculated by a single degree, his people would pay for it with blood. Deborah was a real woman who sat under a real palm tree and bore the weight of a nation's unresolved disputes on her shoulders, day after day, without the title or the army or the institutional support that the men around her took for granted. Gideon was a real man who was genuinely afraid, not performatively, not as a literary device, but with the specific, visceral fear of someone who understood exactly what he was being asked to walk into. His signs were not a lack of faith. They were the honest prayers of a person who needed to believe, badly, and was not quite there yet. Jephthah was a real man who carried the wound of his rejection into every room he ever entered, who won everything he fought for and lost the one thing he could not replace, and who lived inside that grief for the rest of his life with a dignity the text does not explain but somehow conveys. And Samson, broken, gifted, reckless, consecrated Samson, was a real man who spent his entire life at a distance from the thing he was meant to be, and found it, finally, in a temple in Gaza, with his hands on 2 stone pillars and nothing left to lose. These are not cautionary tales dressed in ancient clothing. These are human beings. And the distance between their world and ours is smaller than we would like to believe. We still live in the gap between what we are called to and what we actually do. We still find ourselves, more often than we would like to admit, threshing wheat at the bottom of a wine press, doing the small, hidden, inefficient thing because the open alternative feels too dangerous, too exposed, too much. We still make vows in moments of desperation that we have not fully thought through, and then discover in the quiet after the crisis the cost we agreed to without reading the terms. We still carry gifts we treat carelessly. We still choose the comfort of what is familiar over the difficulty of what is faithful. We still, in our most honest moments, hear something that sounds like a voice calling us mighty warriors while we are sitting in the bottom of a hole.
I am here.
The question the book of Judges leaves us with, the question it has always left its readers with, across 3,000 years, is not what went wrong with those people back then. The question is what we will do with the next ordinary day. Before the crisis, before the deliverance, in the quiet space where the choices that define us are actually made. If this journey through one of history's most turbulent eras stirred something in you, if the story of a people fighting to hold onto their identity across 3 centuries of pressure and failure and unexpected grace resonated with something in your own story, then this channel exists for you. Like this video if it gave you something worth keeping. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the most important stories are rarely the ones that look triumphant from the outside. Subscribe, because what comes next, the Age of Kings, the rise of David, the construction of Solomon's temple, is every bit as complex, every bit as human, and every bit as alive as what you have just witnessed. The story is not finished. It never was. And in those days, there was no king in Israel. But there was always a hand reaching down into the darkness, finding the ones who had given up on being found, and calling them by a name they did not yet know was theirs.